Imagine waking up tomorrow to a headline that simply says, NATO holds an emergency meeting after a missile enters Turkish airspace. At first glance, it sounds like just another breaking news alert. But hidden behind that one sentence is a terrifying question: the border that could change everything. When most people think about the Middle East, they immediately think of Israel, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. But very few pay attention to Turkey. That is surprising, because Turkey occupies one of the most strategically important positions on Earth. It connects Europe with Asia. It controls the Bosporus Strait, one of the world's most important maritime choke points. It borders Iraq, Syria, and Iran through the wider region. And perhaps most importantly, Turkey is a full member of NATO. That single fact changes everything. Because unlike most countries in the Middle East, Turkey isn't standing alone. An attack on Turkey has implications far beyond its own military. It raises questions for an entire alliance. Could a single missile, accidentally or intentionally, pull more than 30 countries into the same war? History tells us that some of the world's biggest conflicts didn't begin because leaders wanted a global war. They began because of one mistake, one miscalculation, or one decision that spiraled beyond anyone's control. And that's exactly why Turkey matters more than most people realize. Because if Turkey is attacked, the consequences don't stop at Turkey's border. They could reach Washington, London, Paris, and far beyond. So today, let's break down why Turkey sits at the center of one of the world's most dangerous geopolitical fault lines, and whether a conflict involving Iran could ever trigger NATO itself. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep geopolitical documentaries that explain the why behind world events, not just the headlines, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. Why Article 5 terrifies military planners. You've probably heard people mention Article 5, especially whenever tensions rise involving NATO. But what does it actually mean? And why do military planners treat those two words with such caution? Contrary to what many people believe, Article 5 doesn't automatically trigger World War III. It simply states that if one NATO member is attacked, the alliance will treat it as an attack against all. But here's the part most people miss. The treaty doesn't force every country to respond in exactly the same way. Instead, each member decides what actions it believes are necessary. That response could involve military force, intelligence sharing, air defense systems, logistics, cyber support, or economic measures. The exact response depends entirely on the situation. In other words, Article 5 is a political commitment first, and a military response second. Since NATO was founded in 1949, Article 5 has been invoked only once, after the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States in 2001. That alone shows how carefully the alliance treats this decision. Which brings us back to Turkey. Whenever tensions rise near its borders, one question immediately dominates the conversation. What happens if a missile enters Turkish territory? The answer is far more complicated than social media headlines would have you believe. Does one missile mean war? Now, let's imagine two very different scenarios. In the first, a missile is deliberately launched at a Turkish military base. The evidence is undeniable. The target is clear, and the intention is obvious. In a situation like that, NATO leaders would come under enormous pressure to respond collectively, because an attack on one member raises questions for the entire alliance. But now, consider a second scenario. A missile suffers a technical malfunction. Its guidance system fails, causing it to drift off course before briefly entering Turkish airspace and crashing without causing any damage. At first glance, the two incidents might seem similar, but legally, diplomatically, and militarily, they are worlds apart. When something like this happens, governments don't immediately ask, "Did a missile cross the border?" Instead, they begin asking a series of much more important questions. Who launched it? Was it intentional, or was it an accident? Did anyone lose their life? And is there any evidence that this was part of a much larger military operation? The answers to those questions determine everything that comes next. They influence whether countries choose diplomacy, limited retaliation, or a broader military response. In fact, making that distinction has helped prevent major wars on more than one occasion throughout modern history. But here's the challenge. During an active military crisis, leaders rarely have the luxury of time. They don't get hours to carefully analyze every piece of evidence. In many cases, they have only minutes, and sometimes just seconds, to make decisions that could affect millions of lives. And history has shown that those few critical minutes can change the course of the world. Why Iran and Turkey matter to each other. Although they compete for influence across the Middle East, Iran and Turkey are not natural enemies. In fact, they have maintained diplomatic and economic ties for decades. They trade, they cooperate on border security, and despite major disagreements over Syria and regional politics, both governments generally try to avoid direct military confrontation. Why? Because neither side benefits from a full-scale war. Turkey possesses one of NATO's largest armed forces, while Iran possesses one of the region's largest missile arsenals. A direct conflict would be extraordinarily costly for both countries, which is exactly why military planners spend so much time trying to avoid accidental escalation. But avoiding escalation is becoming harder every year, because the region itself is changing. And that's where the real story begins. The new Middle East. Over the past few years, the Middle East has transformed faster than almost anyone expected. Wars, proxy conflicts, drone attacks, cyber operations, economic sanctions. Each crisis has added another layer of instability. At the center of many of these developments stands Iran. For decades, Iran built regional influence through alliances with armed groups across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. Supporters describe this as strategic deterrence. Critics argue it increases instability across the region. Either way, one fact is undeniable. Iran's regional strategy extends far beyond its own borders, and when tensions rise, those networks immediately become part of the global conversation. Which raises another question. If a larger regional conflict ever erupted, would Iran really be fighting alone? Or would the conflict spread through multiple countries at the same time? That question leads us to one of the most misunderstood parts of modern geopolitics: Iran's network of regional partners, and whether it remains as powerful as many people believe. Most people believe that if a missile enters the territory of a NATO country, every member of the alliance immediately goes to war. That makes for dramatic headlines, but reality is far more complicated. NATO doesn't operate like a giant red button that automatically launches a military response. The first step is intelligence. Military satellites begin collecting data. Radar systems replay the missile's flight path, while intelligence agencies compare launch signatures, communication intercepts, and satellite imagery. Within hours, officials try to answer one critical question. Was this an accident, or was it an attack? That single answer could determine whether diplomats pick up the phone or fighter jets take off. And this is exactly why military strategists fear miscalculation more than almost anything else. History has shown that wars don't always begin because countries want them. Sometimes they begin because leaders make decisions with incomplete information. A radar operator misidentifies a target. A missile loses guidance. A commander assumes the worst. And within minutes, events begin moving faster than diplomacy can keep up. That is why every incident involving NATO territory receives enormous attention, even if it never turns into a full-scale conflict. But let's assume for a moment that tensions continued to rise. What would Turkey actually do? The answer surprises many people. Turkey doesn't need to wait for NATO to defend itself. It already possesses one of the strongest militaries in the region. Its air force, drone capabilities, missile defenses, and large standing army make it one of NATO's most capable members. In recent years, Turkey has also invested heavily in its domestic defense industry, reducing dependence on foreign suppliers while expanding its ability to produce advanced military equipment. That means any country considering direct military confrontation with Turkey would have to think very carefully about the consequences. But military strength is only one part of the equation. The other part is geography. Turkey sits between Europe, the Middle East, the Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Major energy routes pass nearby. Critical shipping lanes depend on regional stability. Millions of people and billions of dollars in trade move through this region every year. A conflict involving Turkey wouldn't remain a local issue for long. Financial markets would react. Energy prices could rise. Shipping insurance costs could increase overnight. Governments across Europe would immediately begin preparing for economic as well as military consequences. And that's why preventing escalation becomes everyone's priority. Even countries with serious disagreements often maintain military communication channels during crises. Not because they trust each other, but because misunderstandings can be catastrophic. Sometimes a single phone call between defense ministers prevents weeks of escalation. Sometimes it doesn't. That's the uncertainty that makes modern geopolitics so dangerous. Because today's wars are no longer fought only with tanks and fighter jets. Economic sanctions, cyber operations, information warfare, diplomatic pressure. All of these tools are now part of the battlefield. In many cases, countries try every option available before risking direct military confrontation. That's especially true when nuclear powers and military alliances are involved. And this brings us back to the original question. Could one missile drag NATO into war? The honest answer is, it's possible, but highly unlikely on its own. One isolated incident would almost certainly trigger investigations, emergency meetings, diplomatic pressure, and increased military readiness before any alliance-wide military response. However, if that incident were clearly intentional, if lives were lost, or if it became part of a larger pattern of attacks, the calculations could change dramatically. That's why governments spend so much time trying to prevent crises from reaching that point. Because once escalation begins, controlling it becomes incredibly difficult. The lesson here goes far beyond Turkey or Iran. The greatest danger in international politics isn't always deliberate aggression. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding that arrives at the worst possible moment. A wrong calculation, a technical failure, a decision made under enormous pressure. History reminds us that global conflicts often begin with moments that seemed small at first, but carried consequences no one fully understood. Which is why every missile launch, every military exercise, and every diplomatic statement is watched so closely by governments around the world. The hope, of course, is that these moments remain warnings and never become the first chapter of a much larger war. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more documentaries that go beyond the headlines, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the biggest threat to global stability today? Military power, economic pressure, or simple human miscalculation? I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next video.